Very good. So again, very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. Thanks very much for joining our new online course, Regulating Global Supply Chain and Empower Workers. And very welcome to participate in today's workshop. This week, we have very interesting topics already. We had economic clusters, we had international trade agreements, rules. And today, we are very happy to have Meghna with us to have talk a little bit of the international industrialization through global supply chain, lessons from East Asian economies. So very welcome to Meghna. She works at the Center for Economic Studies and Plannings at the JNU, India. So before we start it, let me just remind you, please keep your microphone muted while the session is going on, unless we will open for discussions. And please use the raise hand function whenever you have questions. So just use it. Or if you want, you can also text in the chat box. So the session will be followed with two main questions, which are coming from the discussions under our video lectures. And after the first question be answered, we are open the floor for the questions. So again, thank you very much, Meghna. So the first question is this. It seems that countries fail to industrialize have similar features as many of course participants have identified in the exercise sessions, which they identified the reliance on homogeneous export products, which often low value added, raw materials, natural resources, or limited support in the innovation and technological sectors, unregulated FDI inflows, lack of links with domestic sectors, so on and so forth. So given so, what prevents the second-tier countries to industrialize by adopting a comprehensive industrial policy? We can also expecting some factors in the international context. Thanks again, it's your floor.
Right. Hello, thank you for having me. I was very glad to do the video lecture. I think about this question, there are, I think, three sorts of things that I'd like to bring up. The first is obviously the internal political economy factors of different countries, which are the nature of the class conflict in different countries, who comprises the elite, who comprises the current political regime, which is also part of the second question, I think. But I think more importantly, and specifically for the East Asian economies industrialization, is the context, is the international context or the global political economy, which is to say that in the post-World War II era, there was a brief period of time in which countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan were very important for imperial powers like the United States to use against the spread of socialist ideologies. This is in the context of the Cold War, obviously. And this means that these countries were sort of uniquely positioned for a brief period of time, at least, to use the industrial policies that they were able to use. This means, for example, that the US ran deliberately massive amounts of current account deficits against each of these countries in the sort of commodities that they wanted to export. And there were no obligations on South Korea, Taiwan, or Japan to undertake similar levels of imports. Allowing these countries the space to use these industrial policies was important. And the second-tier countries did not have this to the same extent. They weren't able to use the US, it just wasn't available to them. So rather than think about why the political regimes themselves did not undertake the same kind of industrial policy, I think it's important to look at were they allowed to do so? And we know that since then, especially in the 21st century, as the neoliberal policy framework has sort of taken prominence, it's sort of become the dominant ideology of international organizations, etc., that the policy for developing countries to pursue that the space for developing countries to pursue those same kind of industrial policies is extremely bleak. The WTO, with the coming of the GATT, for example, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and subsequently the WTO, these policies are simply not available to developing countries at all. So I think it's sort of important to look at, it's more important to look at the space for industrial policy that was allowed to the first tier countries and the second tier countries. Those were very different. And I think in this respect, it's sort of important to bring up Alice Amsden's work, who is also mentioned in the references list to the reading that was accompanying the video lecture. And the third sort of point that I'd like to bring up is the limited nature of the overall capacity of global supply chains to act as sort of harbingers of industrialization in countries. So all of these countries at this time were recipients of foreign capital, which they were able to engage to export, to increase their exports for growth. All of this obviously meant that they were being integrated into global supply chains. And we know that the nature of global supply chains, that the laws of global supply chains restricts the number of countries in which this sort of policies can be pursued, because capital is relocated where it's cheapest to produce in terms of allowed by the different exchange rates, allowed by different real economy factors, most importantly, the wage rates in different economies, which means that only very few countries can at one time be recipients of this sort of privilege to use this sort of policy. At the time, therefore, there were only about 7 or 8 countries, the East Asian economies, India to some extent, and Brazil also to some extent, as well as China, obviously, that were able to use foreign capital to grow. So yeah, I think it's important to remember that an over-reliance on export markets isn't going to get countries very far. And it's very important to focus on the home market, to develop home markets, which I think South Korea and Taiwan did to a significant extent. They were able to focus on their home markets and sort of balanced both home and international markets for growth. So I think I'd like to sort of end my answer to the first question here.
Yes, excellent. Yes, that's very good. You remind us of this international context. Yeah? We have learned the international rules, investment trade agreements, which have limited the space. But here you also give us the perspective of this kind of changing the mainstream ideologies or the international context, which are favored somehow at that moment, not for the right now moment, since many countries today we would address as a second tier. So now we are open the floor for questions. Please, you can use the raise up function in the Zoom, or you can text your questions, or since we have very few participants, so you can just raise your hand, please. The questions can be also coming from when you are watching the video lecture, you have some doubts. It does not necessarily have to connect with our first questions. Yes, please, Gifford, please. The floor is yours.
I think it's really interesting to bring in the context of the Cold War and literally the first flashpoints of really literal hot wars. The Korean War really changed the geopolitical balance, where in some ways Japan became like a supply depot for the US war effort in Korea. And then a generation later with the Vietnam War, Korea in some ways became a supply depot for the Vietnam War. And Korea not only supplied it and aided it, but supplied mercenaries to fight in the Vietnam War. So I think that's really important context. What you brought up is the Cold War and the geopolitical balance of forces, but also just literally supply chains. If we look at the companies that containerized, the first trans-Pacific movement of containers was for the war effort. It was the Sealand Corporation created by Malcolm McLean that created the containerization that would bring military supplies from the west coast of the US to Vietnam. But then they would go back empty, and McLean said, oh my God, why don't I see if Japanese exporters will fill those containers? And it took off, and we have containerization, which just changed manufacturing and production worldwide. So I think it's just really important, and I'm really grateful that you brought up the context of the Cold War, imperialism, and also these hot wars, where the trans-Pacific trade is really the invention of kind of the neoliberal form of global dispersed production. So I do want to ask you, because it seems like almost all of those countries, the dragons or the tigers, all had also authoritarian governments. Park Chung-hee in South Korea, the KMT in Taiwan. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Taiwan had martial law from the creation of Taiwan until like 1987 with those wave of struggles throughout Asia. So could you maybe talk about the context of the developmental states, like referring to Alice Amston's Asia's Next Giant, is just they're often dictatorships that were actually able to have centrally planned, their central planning that wasn't in any way close to the free markets that everyone touts today. But thank you for your contribution.
Yes, Meghna, may I also follow with a question, because my second main question was actually was similar to Gifford, so I can also put a little bit, so maybe you can give us the answers in the same together. So because some of our course participants does raise the issue of the economic patriotism, right, as one of the factors attributed to the success of the Asian tiger economies during their industrial booming. And so the question of me was like, what do you think of this assertion? Or in a broader sense, to what degree does the first tier countries, as Gifford was mentioned, like this political regime affect the performance of its industrial development, at that time of catching up? And so could you elaborate a little bit more, especially the possible cause thereof, like such as labor and the environment exploitations, human rights? So I think it's quite relevant. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think from the point about authoritarian governments, I don't exactly see the connection between having an authoritarian government and being able to pursue industrial policy, because there's no how do I put this? There's no direct relationship between being able to impose these policies and an authoritarian government. I mean, I think it's more important to look at, in terms of political regime, I think it'd be more important to look at the sort of class conflict that exists at the time, which is to say, I mean, an important thing in this regard would be to look at agrarian relations that changed drastically in both South Korea and Taiwan, and to maybe a lesser extent in Indonesia and Malaysia. And at the beginning of their industrial policy, which sort of redistributed huge amounts of land and very equitably in both those countries. I don't say exactly what those policies have to do with authoritarianism, but that drastic redistribution led to the development of a home market. It led to the development of, it allowed, I mean, other than just the development of home market, they allowed a broader base for growth in these countries, which was very important. I think this is, on this count, lots of other developing countries have failed to deliver. And I would count that as sort of like a first step toward developing a sort of more involved industrial policy, more external looking industrial policy, is to develop and to sort of correct the inequities within the domestic market, especially for developing countries in its agrarian relations, because most people happen to be involved in agriculture. And more than the question of the nature of the political regime, more generally in developing countries' use of industrial policy, I think it's also sort of more important to look at the sort of policy mix that they get right. Because economic patriotism, as you call it, is sort of important, but it doesn't sort of lead to a straightforward relationship between getting the policy mix right. As for example, the current regime in India claims to be very nationalist, but the policy mix that it pursues here right now is extremely neoliberal and toward globalization, which means that it's not exactly true that economic patriotism or nationalist sentiments within the political regime would directly lead to the adoption of the policy mix, that the social and economic policy mix that will lead to positive outcomes for employment or for labor in general, for growth, for economic development and structural transformation. I think a more sort of complex look has to be taken at the current. So before an industrial policy is used, I think it's more important to look at the current state of the economy, the current state of employment, etc., which sort of helps in designing the right kind of policy mix rather than specifically the political regime. And in the current context, this is to go beyond this, the East Asian economies. In the current context, I think it's more important for developing countries to sort of come together at forums like international organizations and WTO to be able to raise the space for industrial development. Because right now they're extremely constrained, and no one country will be able to sort of free the policy space for them to use by themselves, because international finance and global capital will not allow only one country to pursue those policies separately without having other developing countries do the same. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, definitely. When we're looking for some common features to attribute to the success, there are more and more attributions. And I'm very happy you also mentioned about this, about the agri reforms. That's very, very important point as well. But yeah, please, Spesman.
Sarveshwar, actually my question is in the chat box. Can you read it?
Yeah, yes, please go ahead.
No, you just read it. I have given, my question is in the chat box.
Okay, good. So the question is, after independence, India adopted a heavy industrialization strategy for development. How it has impacted on industrialization in India in subsequent years? Is it satisfactory? Yeah, Meghna, would you like to respond?
I think this connects very strongly with what I said right now, that an import substitution policy that was used initially even in South Korea and Taiwan, to the exclusion of everything else, is probably a bad idea, as was shown by the examples of exactly these countries that were quick to move to the other kind of policy, in which they used export channels, in which they used investments and foreign direct investment to their advantage, rather than to focus only on heavy industrialization. In India also, agrarian relations were largely unchanged, despite the commitment of the new independent government to land reforms in the country. These were not undertaken to any significant extent, except in a few pockets in some states, in West Bengal, in Kerala, in Jammu and Kashmir. And I think that was a great hindrance to the development of the home market, and therefore the industrializing prospects for India. So no, I don't think it's satisfactory. And a lot more should have been done.
Okay, great. So is there any more questions? I mean, it's quite difficult, Meghna. It's quite difficult when we compare with different countries, and especially as you mentioned, all the things are tanked in the meantime between the external factors and the internal factors. And so in many ways, it's quite difficult. Yes, Philip, let's please make the questions a little bit brief and short. Then we have more time for the lecturer give us more response. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. On the agrarian issue, I want to ask Megan if to compare between India and South Africa. In South Africa, we're coming from apartheid, where a lot of people's stand has been taken. However, and it also people were not allowed to move freely. And then if you are a migrant labor coming from rural areas, at the same time, the cities wanted a black cheap labor. And then male men were forced to go to work in the city. And then at the same time, the apartheid government was very aware about this, that, okay, are we paying these people little money, and then we don't want to, we are not responsible, and then also not to allow them to move their whole family, to control their movement, was also to avoid responsibility, to look after them when they are old, when they are sick, and then also to supplement their cheap labor. I mean, the small wage that they were earning. So as a result, you have women in the rural areas who are doing subsistence farming, and then they had to look after these men. And then when they are sick, and then when they are old, and then also to supplement their little income. And then the apartheid government benefited a lot. So those women in the rural areas, in fact, have contributed a lot to the economy of this country. And then right now, in this present government, the same women, the same subsistence farming is being systematically ignored. And then now there's a climate change, and then now the situation is narrowing, and then people are now voluntarily moving into urban areas, and then which it's a very dangerous situation, because once that subsistence farming is completely dead, people are gonna die. I mean, without subsistence farming, it's gonna, we can't exist, we can't live. We are living because of. So how's the situation in South Africa and India in that agrarian situation? Thanks.
Yes, Meghna, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right that the colonial governments left these countries in a position in which there was massive amounts of economic drain, but also since independence, things have barely changed to a significant extent, especially since the arrival of the neoliberal framework. There has been more pressure on agriculture to develop productivity in terms of yield per labor involved, rather than in terms of, and this has been to the exclusion of looking at the employment generating powers of agriculture in these developing economies, especially when such a huge proportion of these population depends on agriculture. And yes, that there has been massive amounts of distress migration to urban economies to look for very informalized work, which has absolutely no protection. The ILO's standards for work are completely not even. Respected is one thing, and then informal works in these countries, informal work arrangements in these countries do not adhere to any of those standards. All of this sort of plays into the logic of global capitalism, as well as global value chains, which is exactly what I sort of wanted to bring up, that the power of global supply chains to lead to economic development in these countries is extremely limited, because it depends on cheap wages, cheap labor, forms of work which are not remunerative to people in the country, and that is a hindrance to development in these economies. So to answer your question, and especially in Africa, with the huge amounts of generally in Africa, with the huge amounts of land grabs that have been taking place, the new forms of primitive accumulation that global capital is involved in is only, even though they're using the rhetoric of increasing productivity, increasing food security in these nations, none of those have materialized, especially, and right now this sort of is a huge talking point, because the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which was run by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has failed massively in delivering exactly the sort of things that it promised to deliver, both in terms of productivity, in terms of food security, etc., in any of the 17, I think, African nations that it is involved in. So yeah, I think it's important for the governments in these economies to realize that that these policies are a failure, for public pressure to develop on international organizations to stop imposing these policies on developing countries, especially even during the pandemic, and for these countries to sort of become a collective power at international organizations.
Great. Yeah. So any more questions? Otherwise, I can also follow up with a little bit question with when Philip said. So sometimes we often have discussions. Previously, we have this import substitution strategies, and today many people also talking the situation or the experience of China somehow using the cheap labor strategies. As Philip also mentioned about this, do you think in today's context, the cheap labor such strategy to industrialize, to calling investment, capital inflows would give any possibility to catch up?
I think China is extremely uniquely positioned to use those policies for its development. First, because of its large size. If it uses something for export, then it always has the option of selling it in the domestic market because of the size of its domestic market. It uses very strong protectionist policies. It regulates its capital inflows and the sort of and it's able to sort of police its capitalist class quite strongly. And all of these is just not possible to the same extent in other countries because of different sizes, but also significantly because, as I've mentioned already, that not all countries can together use the same policy for industrializing, in the sense that if all of these developing countries are competing on cheaper labor, then it's a lose-lose for everyone involved. And here I'd like to bring back the discussion to East Asian economies, because what happened after the financial currency crisis of East Asia is that it quickly came to the fore that all of these economies are sort of competing on a very limited set of sectors. And once a crisis hit, and once there was sort of a saturation in the international market for demand of these commodities, which was inevitably going to happen, that all of these countries immediately lost out on their export growth, on their industrializing growth. So I think these sectors were the auto sector, etc. And I think only two economies, China and the Philippines, we would say were able to recover their export growth to a significant extent. China, just because it was diversifying its export base to involve a huge set of sectors. But again, it's not possible for all of these countries to do the same. And this competition between developing countries over cheap labor is an important instrument in global supply chains to make this even cheaper. It serves no one but the large capitalist class, and it serves not even workers in the developed economies. So it's a lose-lose for everyone involved. And I don't necessarily think that this policy package can be used by developing economies now at all.
Excellent. Yeah. Do we have any other following questions? Otherwise, we can also discuss a little bit of my second main question, which is the second part of that, because often when we're talking about the East Asian tigers or the miracles, what's the international organization, or sometimes we referring to, often we neglect the other side of the success, which is the cost of labor and the cost of nature, which we see much consequences now in China after the massive investment, massive exploitations in the coastal regions with these sweatshops and so on and so forth. So could you give us some more elaborations on this set of this kind of the success stories of these East Asian economies?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the cost of work, the cost of natural resources has been extremely diminished in these economies because of the reliance on the export of these commodities, either in embodied form or directly in terms of the export of primary commodities to developed economies, and that a large part of the movement of production across global supply chains to these economies lies exactly with this that. And you can pick up any developing country right now in the whole world, and within the last 2 or 3 months you would see massive amounts of neoliberal policies that have that are continually attacking the value of natural resources within these economies. So forests forests are being sold or being auctioned or deforested at very cheaply. People are being thrown out of their homes in indigenous communities all over the world. Land grabs are becoming increasingly a problem for all developing countries, especially in Africa. And I mean, from the point of view of climate change and just how sustainable this is for the whole world to continue, just as a strategy for the survival of capitalism, it's just it's not sustainable. Yet primitive accumulation only accelerates within these economies. So other than in East Asia, in the Southeast Asian economies and the second tier economies where primary commodities had become sort of the engine of growth initially, it's also the case that all of this is rapidly accelerating in all other developing economies. And the rural communities, indigenous communities, women, informal workers everywhere suffer to a great extent and continue to do so as more time passes by, unfortunately. And the only hope, and yes, in China, that was a cost of their extreme industrialization, in that they sort of neglected the cost in terms of nature, and large amounts of waste was exported to these economies from developed economies just because it was easier to dump it in developing economies like China and India, which I think is sort of being reversed to some extent in China. Some policies very recently have been targeting exactly this kind of thing, and this is important for all other developing economies as well, to sort of combat the attack on their economic territory, their natural resources, by the forces that be.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much for the good response. Do we have any other following up questions? You can, yeah, please, Ramon, it's your floor.
Thank you very much, Meghna, for. I'm trying to look on what you have mentioned earlier, that probably one of the attributing factor in the development of this Asian miracle, if you try to look on those first tier countries, for example, South Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, probably Japan. It could also attributes to the domestic political economy, wherein at those period of their industrialization, you could deduce that the leaders of their respective countries are, well, uh, uh, politicians coming from the army. So in a sense, it has also contributed to such a control in imposing policies that would really catapult them into development, for example, in applying a numerous policy mix that will benefit their industry. of course, it also attributed to the support of the state. For example, in South Korea, wherein the chaebols, they for a massive capital to oligarchs and business elites. So I'm not quite sure whether at those period wherein they start to build up their their industry would attributed to those factors. Aside from, of course, they well uh, develop their industry by producing manufactured commodities. Unlike, for example, in our country, the Philippines, that for such a long time we also have these natural resources, that we have minerals. But at this point, we're still exporting primary commodities without any value added activities. For example, we have potential in nickel. We exported heavily nickel, those nickel producing for use for computers, mobile phones, but we have not harnessed those potentials because, of course, lack of financial capital, support of the state in development, and clustering of production in different economic sites. So, but I mean that we have the same regime like those first tier countries before. We have the Duterte regime, which considered us a much more authoritarian than the previous regime, but we have not reached those strategy on really developing a comprehensive industrial policy. But I sense that there are still some nationalists, businessmen that are still now beginning to realize that they have to have this opportunity to integrate into the global value chain. I remember what Professor Herr mentioned in his workshop that industrial policy are becoming fashionable nowadays. So that's why I have the sense that now they're coming back to think about industrial policy because previously in the previous years it's such nothing, no discussion about industrial policy, no coordination between business and associations. But now there's this thing that they try to come up. So would you think that uh, it is now high time again to use the same strategy of developing uh, industrial policy, taking into account what has been the East Asian Miracle strategy has been adopted before to integrate into the global value chain? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think that those same strategies that the first tier countries used are available at the current moment for any developing country to use at this time. And on the other hand, I think that the opportunities that are, as you say, that are provided by the integration into global supply chains are very limited in the sense that as as we've been saying, that global supply chains sort of can create positive outcomes for workers and others in these economies, especially when there's especially in the context of a lack of investment from other sources, from domestic sources or from other foreign investment sources. But the problem with global supply chains is that you must remember that these are volatile inflows, and unless we're able to regulate, unless these industrial policies are also able to regulate the inflows of foreign investment, if they're, as long as they're able to use them precisely to the advantage of these economies' interests, the integration into global supply chains in and of itself, I don't think can produce the same kind of results that were produced in the first tier countries. And exactly these kind of policies that would sort of help, that would sort of make integration into global supply chains lead to positive outcomes in developing countries are exactly those policies that are sort of outlawed or are not allowed by international organizations. The WTO simply won't allow using, for example, the TRIMS part of the WTO, the investment-related measures, simply do not allow these countries to undertake a lot of regulating industry inflows to the same extent that you would want to use. They can't use research and development in the same ways. They can't use they can't force international capital to share their know-how with developing countries. Which means that if this international capital were to flow out of the country tomorrow, which nothing stops it from because of the same neoliberal policy framework that is being pursued everywhere else, that now those countries which were sort of at least benefiting from global supply chains in terms of employment and income will suddenly lose out on it, which is exactly what happened during the crisis, the East Asian financial crisis. And so I think while they have some limited opportunities for developing countries to use, especially during brief periods of time, I don't think that the sort of policies that make those outcomes happen are exactly available to countries right now. The biggest example is the lack of the patent paper on vaccines for COVID-19. That despite large amounts of advocacy and large amounts of protest at international forums, is not being allowed to developing countries, which if these patents were removed, would be able to undertake production of these vaccines. And I think that would be a huge contribution to industrializing and to economic recovery in these countries. And yet this won't happen. So I think the most important thing to look at right now is the international, the trade framework, the international finance flows, the sort of policy framework that's dominant and being imposed by international organizations on developing countries using mechanisms like aid and loans and their structural adjustment programs that sort of bind developing countries to adhere to policies that cannot let them use industrial policy in the same way that has been used in the first tier countries.
Yes, Indira, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I know we have to go for short questions and comments, but I think, Meghna, you understand that it's such a complex issue. It's very difficult. I think we are all struggling with the different examples that are coming, how to make sense of that. And then, yes, you make the point that you can make an industrial policy while respecting workers' rights or, labor standards, but it's kind of hard to have examples in the real world that show that that's what happened. And I think even if we go to, we are referring here to first tier countries in terms of East Asian, right? Like with reference to the already industrialized countries. But even if we go to the history of industrialized countries, they also had during their development really strong repression of workers' rights and so on. So somehow you need that one to create some sort of competitive advantage to have the first step, right, to industrialize, and then eventually, and that's terrible because it's terrible for countries that want to industrialize now, because now you even have more levels of competition, right? You have developed countries, first-tier countries, second-tier countries, and other countries. So you have all this complexity coming from that. You have on top of that the limitations coming from the global trade regime, from WTO and all the other agreements flying around. And then you have the environmental crisis in terms of really, can you still industrialize, with no regard to environment, as all these countries did? So it's become so difficult. And I'm wondering, so far we are looking at this almost dichotomy, like either you go import substitution or you go full integration in global supply chains, completely export-oriented economies. I'm wondering, is there something in between in which, we try to change in the process the model of consumption, trying to have the goods produced closer to where we live, while perhaps looking at certain advantages in terms of engaging in the global economy, but not necessarily saying we just engage in cheap labor in the garment, so that would be my country, or in exporting commodities because that's where the opening is. And yeah, sorry again for the long thing, but I think I'm also struggling to trying and understanding what is the real space and what are the policy options for countries that are trying to industrialize given all these constraints.
I completely agree with you on everything that you said, that yes, that in terms of having a comparative advantage in cheap labor means that workers' rights are going to be seriously compromised in all of these countries. And so relying on that to integrate into global supply chains isn't exactly benefiting the workers that it exploits to make use of in the first place. I completely agree. And yes, the environmental crisis makes it even more difficult to pursue the same kind of policies that have sort of been pursued till now. In terms of a midway between these two, I think it's sort of important to first to acknowledge exactly the kind of constraints that exist on the policy space for each country. Not just policy space for external or outward oriented industrialization, but toward its own domestic policy, toward its own domestic investment space, which involves the use of protectionist policy if that's necessary. It involves regulating investments, both foreign and domestic. It involves regulating and undertaking investment by the public sector in sectors that are by the domestic government in sectors which are important for climate change purposes, for the care economy, etc., that can lead to growth outcomes for these countries, growth and development outcomes, but that do not compromise on environmental objectives that must be pursued globally at the moment. And all of these policies that need to be used, or that must be used, according to me, for exactly this kind of outcome, are not sort of permitted by the global rules, the rule framework that exists at the moment, which is to say that this, first of all, must be fought against. International finance is so strong that if any of these policies, if, for example, fiscal stimulus in developing economies was to increase to the same extent as it increased in developed economies during the pandemic, then international finance would flow out and almost instantly, and it would leave economies like ours very little space to pursue, to undertake the sort of investment that needs to be undertaken within the country. So I think, according to me, the first thing that must be dealt with is expanding the policy space exactly to the sort of policies that were pursued in East Asia, but even farther, because those policies depended on the benevolence of the imperial powers at the time, which do not exist right now and probably will not exist for the foreseeable future. So our focus as a group of developing countries should be to expand this space, and then once we're able to achieve this space, to undertake exactly the sort of investments that need to be undertaken in the care economy, in the natural economy, etc., in green sectors, which is to say in renewables, etc., for the use and consumption in domestic economies first. Which is not to say that this is an export pessimistic outlook, but I think that it's important to have control over that rather than to integrate the country in a free trade framework with the other economies, because then international capital decides what happens with investments and workers in the country rather than rather than a sovereign, democratically elected government.
Yes, unfortunately, at the end, the main big power is the international capitalism. Maybe so. Sabeswar have one question, and I'm not sure should I read or maybe for Meghna, maybe I don't know if you need some clarification, but for me a little bit confusing. But anyway, so I read here. Role of the state in the present context can be compared to that of the what Adam Smith talked during the Industrial Revolution. And we have seen the consequences like world wars and Great Depression, and then revivals of the state as well, the trade unions. Can we expect the same looking at the present trend of industrial development across the globe? Is that clear for you, or do you...
So Beswa, can you please provide some clarification? What are you asking exactly?
Yes, please. Sabeswar, can you elaborate a little bit? Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, muted.
The way things are going on, like the free market economy and the policies that are followed across the globe. In that context, because Smith was also talking about, a free market and a laissez-faire policies, and we have seen the industrial revolution and what happened after that. So in that context, I asked this question, just comparing that period and industrial development of present period. This is a general question. So if I don't know if it is correct. If the question is correct, I am not sure, but this comes to my mind. That's why.
I think that the state plays, as you said, an important role in revival from crises like the Great Depression that you've mentioned and the World War.
Basically, it is a market versus state debate kind of thing. Market versus state, yeah.
Yeah, and the role of the state can never, even the market is sort of also regulated by the state, and a free market isn't exactly a market in which the state plays no role. The institution of the free market is also sort of protected by the state. So yeah, the state plays an extremely important role, and especially during times of crisis in capitalism, which I think everyone would agree that right now would qualify as a crisis moment in capitalism. And the role of the state in all countries is extremely enhanced and should be used to undertake policy changes. But as I said, the space to do that right now is constricted to a great extent.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and also like the free trade was also advocated by the states, and it was in a certain way the free trade was not actually make the industrial revolution somehow happen. After they industrialize, they push for the free trade in a certain way.
That's
yes, right. I have the before the Tia, Afwa, do you have the question? I saw you raise your hand. Afwa. Oh, it's okay. We can move on. Great. So yes, before Phillips, let's have the question and with Tia. And now, because since we have 4 minutes, so we'll be very brief. So Tia questions. I like your explanation very much, but I'm confused with regard to widening our space. What does it mean? I understood that the consumer awareness is one of the alternative instruments to change the attitude of the global supply chain. It might be more effective than public pressure to the government, etc., especially corrupted governments or not functioning democracy.
It's a difficult question, I know. But looking at the approach of trade unions, global labor union, GOOF, Industrial, we have Raymond here. I'm also working for Mondial FNV, which is very much close, working with the GOOFs and national trade unions. we were also involved in this massive protests for wage increase in Indonesia 2013, which huge success, but short, because 2 years afterwards, the government, they already see us through our strategy in public campaign, etc. So now with the global supply chain, the effort is to increase the awareness of consumption, consumer in developed countries, to change the attitude of buyers, investors, etc. It gives us actually a bit hope. Expectation is high, especially in the agriculture sector. But when you said that, well, global supply chain don't expect so much because they're also very much that driven, FDI. So I really want to know, what do you mean by widening the space? Which space do we still have?
Okay, very thanks to Tia. And also, can we have a very short question from Philips? Then we can have the final remarks from the Meghna. Philip, please keep your question very short because we have 2 minutes.
Okay, right now in South Africa, they're introducing this policy called expanded producer responsibility for the companies doing packages to pay towards their packaging, like for the plastics, whatever, to minimize the climate change problems. And then in this sector, we have waste pickers who are recycling, collecting, and they're the most oppressed informal workers. And then they are not mentioned, they are not participating in this formation of the policy. Nothing is mentioned about them. So how can workers, because this is not only for South African companies, it's for the companies everywhere which are importing their goods to South Africa. So how can the workers be involved in supporting of the waste pickers, not only in South Africa, but all over the world to benefit out of this policy? Thank you.
Well, first for Tia's question, by widening our policy space, I mean exactly that, using global supply chains, but to produce the outcomes that would benefit governments. Sorry, not governments, but workers and the economy. I think that what you said about consumer awareness in developed economies is very important. Because according to me, I think it's a very important tool in increasing public pressure from developed economies that would be of great help in sort of forcing the policies of developed economies, imperial powers, as well as international organizations to change in favor of the kind of things that should occur in developing economies. And I think that public pressure is very important. But I think that consumer awareness in terms of choices is a little limited because, I mean, if it's only because there are such few choices in the market nowadays, because most products are, sold. If you talk about agricultural commodities, there are about 4 or 5 retailing giants in developed economies. And all of them have horrible worker practices, both in developed economies as well as developing economies, which means that the actual choice that is provided to consumers in these nations is so small that simply through the means of exercising that choice, I think very little change can be made, except, so from that consumption choice, I think little can arrive, but from consumer awareness can lead consumer awareness can lead to great amounts of public pressure, which is, I think, the key way to change, to widen our public policy space for developing economies to be able to sustain the sort of change that you said has already happened, but you had to go back on it. To be able to sustain those policy changes, I think continued public pressure from both developing and developed countries is necessary.
Yes, sorry for the interruption. And yeah, because we like to keep on time, so could you give the final remarks to the Philip question?
Yes.
And also like to remind everyone to look at Gifford provides the perception from the KCTU on the perception of the East Asian miracles. Yeah, please, your last comment, please.
Okay. Well, I agree, Philip, that I think this sort of policy should be pursued everywhere. And I hope that it will be in the future. And I think that if all developing countries were to pursue it, then it's more likely that they will be able to sustain it as well, linking that with Dia's question. And very briefly for Gifford's remarks, I think, I think that authoritarian governments are also equally infamous for pursuing neoliberal policies. You know, in Chile, you would call that an authoritarian government that pursued exactly the opposite sort of industrial policy that sort of ruined the economy of that country for a long time to come. And I think focusing on that of the political regime exactly is sort of to distract from the policy mix that is pursued in these economies.
Great. So we have very lively discussion today, and a very, very big thanks to Meghna. And thanks everyone for participating in today's